I think science offers a great deal. It has already offered us a great deal on the impact side, so the problem side. What I'm arguing is that it also needs to now think about the solution side. And it's a different kind of science where we have to do a learning by doing. And so the scientists are the ones who do. They're going to have to team up with doers. What I argue is that we have become aware of the problem of the impacts of climate change for some time now, from the scientific community looking at impact models. More recently, in the second assessment report of the IPCC, we looked at the bottom-up vulnerability of different countries, and when you look at the countries by themselves, you find that the poorest countries obviously are amongst those that are the most vulnerable. A, because they're poor, and B, because they happen to be located in parts of the world which are going to be affected by floods or droughts or hurricanes and cyclones. And so there are particularly vulnerable parts of the world which are relatively the poorest parts of the world. Even in rich countries, there are poor communities who are also vulnerable, like you had in Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans. The people who died, over 1,000, were not the rich people of New Orleans, they were the poor people of New Orleans. So poor people, by and large, everywhere tend to be more vulnerable. And my argument is that we are now looking at ways to decrease that vulnerability and increase their ability to adapt. So in the climate change jargon, we call that adaptation to climate change. And I'm arguing that this is now a relatively young but still a significantly new scientific endeavor where we are learning how to deal with these impacts of climate change. The places and countries and communities who are learning fastest are the ones who are being hit the hardest. So the communities and countries like Bangladesh and the vulnerable communities are actually going up a very steep learning curve on how to deal with the problem, and are actually the ones who know more about how to deal with it than the relatively rich countries who haven't been hit with the problem yet, but will be hit tomorrow and day after. So in this particular case, the rich have much to learn from the poor. The rich generally find it much more difficult to deal with it, like a major power cut in New York, for example. We have power cuts in Dhaka every day. We know how to deal with it.
Right. So one thing that I've found over the years is that a lot of what's needed in many places is resilience to climate hazards, more than adaptation to climate change. Sometimes everything gets cast as climate change adaptation, but if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, and I wrote in 2009 about a paper in Science where showing that there's implicit deep vulnerability to super droughts there, 100-year droughts, and you look at population trends and poverty, durable poverty, and you say, and the climate models there are still equivocal on whether it's going to get wetter or drier. So that's not climate change adaptation.
No, you're quite right. I mean, there's a very important time dimension here, where the climate change model-based predictions or scenarios are decadal timescales. They're about what's going to happen 50 years, 100 years from now, and it might go this way, it might go that way. We're not quite sure. Some places we have better ideas of which way it's going to go. Some places not. On the other hand, climate variability, which is the immediate climatic shocks that people are used to, like cyclones, hurricanes on the one hand, floods on the other. These are extreme events that take place very quickly. Longer-term droughts, these are phenomena we have known in the past. These are all getting a lot more frequent. That's quite a genuine, observation. There's an increase in...
it depends on where you look.
It depends on where you look, absolutely. So I'll give you Bangladesh's case. Bangladesh, we have a very long hydrological record of the Ganges Brahmaputra going back, hundreds of years. And we have a relatively significantly set pattern of 1 in 20-year floods. They come 1 in 20 years. They have been doing that for the last 200 years. The last 20 years, we've had 4 of them. 4 magnitude 120-year floods.
Right.
That's a significant increase. So the 1 in 20 year is now 1 in 5 years.
Right.
Now, you're quite right to say this can't be absolutely attributable to climate change, but it is what you would expect to happen with human-induced climate change.
Right. And
the
then
temperature has gone up by 0.8 degrees since pre-industrial already.
Right. And
so
you add on to that, and you add on to that land use change,
and
which water flows change,
exactly.
and dams,
and this overlays on human settlements, on how we have actually sometimes made ourselves even more vulnerable by
Many times.
putting up our houses and settlements in places where we shouldn't be doing that.
And that's as true in rich countries as poor countries.
It's true in all countries as well.
I've written about that. From Colorado to Texas to
the point I made is the first thing to do is to stop doing maladaptation.
That was a wonderful
where we're going.
point. Right.
So let's just stop doing that to start with.
So science, what can science offer here going forward?
I think science offers a great deal. It has already offered us a great deal on the impact side, so the problem side. What I'm arguing is that it also needs to now think about the solution side. And it's a different kind of science where we have to do a learning by doing. And so the scientists are the ones who do. They're going to have to team up with doers. And the doers can be a farmer, it can be a decision maker, mayor of a city, it could be officials in ministries, it could be NGOs. They're doing stuff.
Right.
So the researchers need to hook up with the people who are doing things and extract good knowledge out of that experience. What works, what doesn't work. And I would argue right now, the most important thing is what doesn't work.
Right.
So we need to try different things, and we know some will work and some won't work. We have to allow for failure and learn from failure, which is quite difficult in convincing donors and funders, for example. They all want to be certain that the money is going to be
By the way,
for success.
And another thing that's very relevant here is sharing both successes and failures. Communication, that's my arena is communication.
Absolutely, I think communication is key, and this collaboration doesn't happen unless you communicate well.
Social networks. In Nepal, I wrote about how communities were using Twitter and Facebook to say, hey, a helicopter hasn't come here yet. And in India, there's now a farmer-to-farmer YouTube education happening. How much of that can be transferred?
Social media, I think, can be transformative. And in my view, the paradigm I promote now in terms of tackling climate change is solidarity. Solidarity between the polluter, the individual polluter, including myself. I have a big carbon footprint. I fly around the world all the time, and I recognize that. And the victim of pollution. And we know who they are, and I can connect them. And social media is a very good way of connecting with the farmers in Bangladesh, between India and the US. So let us use these potentially transformative new technologies to enable us to build these bridges between people across the world in a more effective manner. And it's not about money. So I don't like putting this in, pigeonholing it into just giving money. It's not about giving money. It's about expressing a sense of responsibility, expressing a sense of solidarity, learning from each other, a two-way learning process, and that builds solidarity.
There is a crisis element here. It's an urgent situation, especially for emissions and for vulnerability reduction. But I think, to me, there's value in normalizing this to a certain extent. Working in a sustained, engaged way on reducing vulnerability to climate hazards, on reducing emissions. And it's a very different thing than the old approach was seal the deal, as if one round of the climate treaty or one President of the United States would make the difference. Do you agree, or do you think that's not right?
I agree to the following extent. I think we still need global agreements to ratchet up and raise ambition. And so I'm hopeful we'll get something in Paris, but not over hopeful because we've been disappointed many times before. On the other hand, what gives me further hope is that the negotiations under the Framework Convention are no longer the only game in town. In fact, they're not even the most significant game in town. The most significant games are people doing things. Mayors of cities, farmers, people all over the place. I work with vulnerable communities. They are very, very active on this issue. They have become over the last few years. So the activities are going on all over the place. Divestment from outer fossil fuels, a whole big new sort of movement of its own that's not linked to UNFCCC at all. So I see much more actions, and I agree with you in the sense of these will become normative. We'll all do what we need to do, we'll learn what we need to do, and we'll do what we need to do. And we'll do it out of a sense of responsibility, a sense of solidarity. And if we get a global agreement for the leaders, all the better, but it isn't essential anymore.
Actually, I just remembered one other question. There's some who say that the best adaptation strategy is to make poor people less poor. That's simply build economies. What do you think about that?
I think so. I think, in a development deficit location, which is a description of most of the poor countries around the world, they need to develop. The challenge is going to be develop in a non-polluting manner. If they follow the paradigm of the developed countries with a high fossil fuel footprint for development, that's the wrong way to go. But I think the technology and the ability now to de-link the quality of life development that they aspire to legitimately, all the people that are poor in the developing world, without having a huge carbon footprint as a result of doing that. I think we're now on the cusp of taking the right path to delivering development, but without the pollution associated with it. And that's going to be the challenge for the next few decades.